There is a saying amongst the Imperium of Man, and especially the Adeptus Astartes, only in death does duty end. The phrase itself is self-explanatory. You serve the Emperor until you're dead, but it is undoubtedly the Space Marines who embody it best. Only on a handful of occasions can I recall a loyal Astartes dying somewhere that wasn't on a battlefield of some sort, fighting to the last for the Imperium. However, sometimes even a seeming battlefield death cannot stop a Space Marine from continuing their duties. Those mortally wounded but still with the spark of life can be saved and preserved in a new mechanical form and allowed to fight on. Such warriors can go on to live for millennia until the battlefield claims their lives in a more final manner, and they become almost revered in many chapters for their experience and the knowledge that comes with it. Though there are many variants within the Imperium and many mimicries across Chaos and the other factions in the galaxy, these vehicles are all collectively known as Dreadnoughts. This is Tactica Imperialis, and welcome to 40k Stories. At its most basic level, a Dreadnought can be summarised as a war machine crossed with a coffin, a means for a fallen hero of the Astartes to fight on long after death ought to have taken him. It is a bulky and somewhat squat, though still rather agile, walking vehicle, commonly with weapons in place of arms, unless the arm is the weapon of course, and bulky armour plating across much of its form. At the centre of the Dreadnought, roughly where you'd place its heart were it a biological entity, is the only true biological component of the machine, a Space Marine, crippled beyond recovery after a previous battle and preserved by a suite of life support systems built into the Dreadnought. The Astartes is within what is known as a sarcophagus, implanted there by the Tech Marines and the Apothecaries as their only real chance of survival. There they will stay, never to be released while still alive. Implantation into a Dreadnought is a one-way trip, and there's no way the implanted Astartes could survive without its systems. The only way out of a Dreadnought is as a corpse if a subsequent battle finally kills you. Assuming of course the Dreadnought doesn't explode and take you with it, which does seem to happen quite a lot from what I hear. The pilots have an interface with the Dreadnought through a device known as a Mind Impulse Unit, which allows them to operate the weapons and other functions of their new body no matter the physical injuries that led to their implantation. The limited number of Dreadnought chassis in the typical Astartes motor pool due to a near inability to make more, combined with the assumedly lengthy stays any pilot normally has within them, means that implantation into a Dreadnought is not a procedure to be undertaken lightly. For starters, there is probably a fine line concerning the viability of a pilot to survive any implantation procedures compared to their chance of recovery by any other more conventional means. This is also a decision that must be made quickly, given the often fatal injuries sustained by any prospective pilot. But there is also a question of whether someone, and forgive me if this is a poor phrasing, deserves to be implanted. A typical Dreadnought will remain in service to their chapter for decades, centuries, perhaps even millennia to come, and so it is perhaps understandable to ensure that the right sort of Space Marine is implanted within them. By that, I mean that a good Dreadnought pilot, at least if you ask the Space Marines, would be someone who is either versed in or able to learn the history of the chapter, both past and present, in order to pass that knowledge on in the future. And ideally they'd have a clean disciplinary record and or a lengthy roll of honour that means they set a good example to those around them. This means that high-ranking chapter members, such as captains, are much more likely to be made into Dreadnoughts if the chapter is capable of doing so, whilst a promising young recruit fresh out of the scout company is probably less likely, though actually it's likely happened at some point. Attitudes toward Dreadnoughts are also somewhat inconsistent, perhaps unsurprisingly given the diversity of Space Marines across the galaxy. There are many chapters who see implantation into a Dreadnought as an honour. Obviously they probably don't want it for themselves since it involves being mortally wounded and potentially dying, but they regard the often ancient pilots with great respect for continuing to serve the Emperor even beyond the point of their death. Remember that phrase from the beginning, only in death does duty end. Should a Dreadnought from these sorts of chapters fall in battle, killed by whatever the galaxy has to throw at them, The former brothers will fight like hell to recover the chassis and the body. After all, the former is near irreplaceable, and the latter probably deserves a proper memorial for all that they've contributed. However, there are also chapters for whom a dreadnought is almost a fate worse than death. The White Scars are a particularly famous example who supposedly have no dreadnoughts at all, believing that the confinement of a warrior's spirit within a sarcophagus of any kind is, well, wrong is putting it mildly. I suspect that if there are any similar chapters who do have dreadnoughts of their own, they will see their fallen brothers with a mix of pity as well as respect in some ways. The Grey Knights actually spring to mind here, though I think there is less pity and more respect there due to their own beliefs. There was, interestingly, a time where non-Astartes dreadnought pilots supposedly existed. Admittedly, this is just a rumour from the Unification Wars before there was even such a thing as Astartes, so I don't know if any of even the Great Crusade era patterns would have been compatible. Speaking of patterns, the most common variant of dreadnought is known as the Castor Ferrum, either Mark IV or Mark V, though there are supposedly 26 of the bloomin' things. Designed on Mars itself, this type of dreadnought uses a thermic reactor as a power source and can be armed with a huge array of weapons that makes it very versatile at range and in melee. Like all dreadnoughts, the Castor Ferrum does contain speakers that allow for communication between pilot and everybody else. Apparently it's pretty creepy given how the voice sounds, but it is a vital part of the almost bonus role of a dreadnought as historian and storyteller of battles from before their internment. Admittedly, they probably don't spend all that long doing so, especially as they get older within their adamantium and ceramite pseudo-tombs. I hesitate to use the phrase going senile, but many dreadnoughts become more and more forgetful or muddled as the years go by. Their memories get hazy, they become prone to rambling or getting sidetracked in conversation, and they sleep. A lot. Some of the most ancient dreadnoughts are only roused for maintenance or as part of ceremony or emergency. Otherwise, they are left to rest as time takes its toll on them. It's sad in its own way, but age rarely diminishes the skills of the pilots within. They still have an incredible mental sharpness when the situation calls for it, and they are often the most experienced warriors in the ranks of their chapter, and thus exceptionally dangerous combatants, even without the nearly 12-foot killing exosuit that they call home. Though the Castor Ferrum variant is almost certainly the most common type of dreadnought, there are many more types, both universal across the Astartes and also unique to certain chapters. Probably the nearest universal variant to the Castor Ferrum is the Venerable Dreadnought, which is a very similar if not identical hull, just a lot fancier and with a much more elaborate look. They get this extra fanciness for one simple reason. Remember those ancient dreadnoughts that I mentioned, pretty much living legends of their chapters? Yep, that's these guys. I don't have a minimum age to qualify for venerable status, but it'll probably be centuries, if not millennia, I would guess. With that age comes unrivaled experience and seemingly nigh-on indestructibility, as it takes nothing short of an exploded sarcophagus to finish some of them off. The weaponry on these guys is pretty similar to a Castor Ferrum, and there is even a venerable variant reserved specifically for the members of the Reclusium. These seemingly incredibly rare Chaplin Dreadnaughts combine the resilience and power of a Dreadnought with the oratory and rage of a Chaplain, a potent mix, I'm sure you'd agree, though there are sadly no Dreadnought scale Crozius Arcanums, which is a disappointment. The other variant of Dreadnought very similar to the Castor Ferrum is the Ironclad Dreadnought. No, I'm not counting the long-range Hellfire and the close-range Siege Dreadnought as unique, they're just different weapon loadouts. The Ironclad is, in essence, a much more heavily armoured version of the Castor Ferrum, piling the plating onto the front and then strapping on an array of grenade launchers to boot. Often used as fortress or bunker breakers, the Ironclads can take far more punishment than their compatriots and, should they close distance, utterly mess up any structure or being that gets in their way. A variant I'd long considered to be chapter unique, but that it actually isn't, is the Librarian Dreadnaught. This had long been exclusive to the Blood Angels and their successors as far as I knew, but it seems as though the Death Watch has gotten its hands on the schematics and implemented it too for their psychic members who wish to use them, should they need it, and don't ever want to go back to their parent chapter. Yeah, Death Watch Dreadnoughts never go home, should mention that. Essentially, it's a Dreadnought that can cast psychic powers and is also armed with what I can best describe as a giant force weapon punch dagger thing. Yeah, don't let one of those anywhere near me, please. The Librarian Dreadnaughts are actually a variant of the Blood Angel exclusive Furioso Dreadnoughts, first believed created in M35 and trading in ranged power for melee and close support supremacy. Unfortunately, even these near-dead warriors are not safe from the curse of Sanguinius' genetics, and so the Death Company can occasionally go to the field, reinforced by their own berserk dreadnoughts. Admittedly, those Death Company dreadnoughts, as they are known, who survive a given engagement are not necessarily slain by High Chaplain Astorath, as discussed in a previous log. Instead, when they eventually are shut down by the Tech Marines, a choice is made on whether to remove the pilot for a still sane Blood Angel, or to let the Black Rage Afflicted fight again. The other chapter with particularly infamous gene seed is the Spacewalks, and just like the scions of the Angel, the sons of Russ's Dreadnoughts aren't safe from their genetics either. Yes, there are actually Wolfen Dreadnoughts, and they are about as terrifying as they sound, partly because unlike a Death Company Dreadnought, they will actually sort of take orders once they've been stared down by a Wolf Lord. The mutation of a pilot caused by the Canis Helix leads to a refit of the Dreadnought as well as a much more melee-focused weapon set, and these man-beast-machine hybrids will pretty much kill until there is nothing left to kill, and then be dealt with by their lord or brothers, depending. With all that said though, there is far more to the Dreadnought than just minor changes to the Castor Ferrum base. The most famous of these is believed to be the oldest, developed and used primarily in the Great Crusade as the primary dreadnought of the Legiones Astartes, the Contempt Dreadnought. The Contempt uses an arc reactor and stands taller than the Castor Ferrum, as well as using a form of shield technology that is also found in Astartes' Storm Shield and the automata of the Mechanicum's Legio Cybernetica. Some in fact believe that the automata and the Contemptor shared similar systems to some extent. Given the pseudo-AI nature of said automata saw them outlawed as the Mechanicum evolved into the Mechanicus, it could be argued that this Dreadnought variant entered a decline in favour as a result. The truth is though, the Lords of Mars broadly seem to have forgotten how to make them. It's now a closely guarded secret amongst only a few tech priests, so the few that remain are usually ancient in the extreme. A more range-focused version, as opposed to the all-rounder of the baseline, this one known as the Contempt Immortus, did see a measure of popularity, and the Psyche-dominated Thousand Suns actually did make a psychic variant known as the Osiron, though it was never rolled out to the other legions. But a similar design of Dreadnought to the Contempt Immortus was developed around the time of the Castor Ferrum, the Deredeo. This heavy weapon platform / walker / big gun field testing device shares many design notes with the Contempt Immortus, notably the shape and the fact that it has no melee weapons. Initially it was difficult to produce, but saw a spike in popularity following the outbreak of the Horus Heresy due to its resilience and its damage output. Nowadays, I assume that said manufacture difficulty, combined with the general downgrade Imperial technological understanding, means that the Deredeo pretty much doesn't exist anymore. There may be the odd one or two in a few chapters here or there, but I doubt there's many if I'm being honest. The last of the older, major non-chapter specific variants of Dreadnought is by far the most imposing, the Leviathan Siege Dreadnought. Supposedly built on Terra as opposed to Mars, without the knowledge of the Mechanicum even, these towering monsters are as resource intensive as an Imperial Knight and are said to have incorporated tech from the fabled Dark Age of technology. I doubt they were that common even in the Great Crusade due to the amount of resources needed to build them, but those that have survived the millennia to the modern era are, despite their undeniable usefulness, rarely unleashed and are even feared as much as anything else by the chapters who still have one. This is because the technology of the Leviathan, whether by accident or design, takes a heavy toll on the minds of its pilots. The machine will kill them eventually, and it seems to torment the pilots with dreams of the Horus Heresy. How the machine itself remembers, I'm not sure, since they're not exactly Titan machine spirits, I don't think, but there you go. As such, a chapter master is the only one authorized to sanction a Leviathan's deployment, as these dreams make the Dreadnought difficult to command. It kind of reminds me of the Blood Angels and their Death Company, though not quite to the same extreme. However, the Leviathan, as deadly to its own pilots as it is, actually pales in terms of pilot murder to the newest variant of Dreadnought to be introduced to the Astartes armory. The Redemptor Dreadnaught, used by wounded Primaris Marines who presumably wouldn't fit in a typical sarcophagus. This thing seems to have been designed by Mechanicus members who had a bit of a vendetta against Space Marines, as the Redemptor's systems can reduce the pilot to a husk in a very short time frame. Some pilots for the earliest Redemptors have already needed replacing, and it's only been a couple of centuries since they took to the field. They're also much bigger and thus more heavily armed than the Castor Ferrum, and possibly even the Leviathan, but still with excellent manoeuvrability. The Primaris might not live all that much longer by being interred into a Redemptor, but they'll damn well go out in a blaze of glory and or corpses, whilst the machine's systems take their toll. There have been many Dreadnought pilots throughout the millennia, and some have become renowned and even legendary over time. Undoubtedly the best known Dreadnought is the individual known as Bjorn the Fell-Handed of the Spacewalks, someone who is also among the oldest of Dreadnoughts too. Some say he's the oldest warrior of all within the Imperium. I think that's true, but I don't want to say with 100% certainty. Bjorn was around during the Great Crusade, and was among the Space Wolves involved heavily in the burning of Prospero early in the Horus Heresy. I've told his tale pre-Dreadnought elsewhere, but he was incarcerated into his sarcophagus in 934 M31 whilst serving as Great Wolf of the chapter in the Proxima Rebellion. At the time, his Castor Ferrum sarcophagus was said to be one of the most advanced around, and whilst he apparently hates all the fancy decorations on it, as well as the fact he actually ended up as a Dreadnought, Bjorn is still a deadly and perhaps even graceful commander with his typical plasma cannon and melee weapon. He spent around 500 years on the front lines before spending more and more time asleep, with his first major reawakening coming when the Space Wolves' homeworld of Fenris was invaded by their old enemy the Thousand Suns in M32. The Battle of the Fang, as it has become known, saw the Wolves actually commanded by their former Great Wolf, as the current one was off-world at the time of the initial invasion. And the tactical mind and the cold anger/survival instinct that Bjorn possesses proved invaluable in helping to hold the line. Bjorn even went head-to-head with the demonic Primarch Magnus the Red at the climax of the battle, and though he would have undoubtedly lost and died had he not been bailed out, he did more damage than the Crimson King had faced since his original duel with Leman Russ over a millennia prior. The Wolves did win out in the end, and Bjorn helped to oversee the rebuilding process, as well as assumedly giving the Great Wolf of the time a very stern talking to about tactical sense before returning to his slumber. He is currently awakened roughly once a century to tell stories as well as when his wisdom is needed. Prime example of that was the Months of Shame and the Cold War with the Inquisition after the First Armageddon War. When that Cold War almost got properly hot and a full invasion fleet hung in orbit over Fenris from the Grey Knights and others, it was Bjorn who was sent, via teleporter, which he wasn't exactly keen on, to negotiate with the inquisitorial forces. Such is his legend that even the Scions of Titan kneeled before him, much to his annoyance. Even when Great Wolf of the time Logan Grimnar killed a Lord Inquisitor, Bjorn was still able to convince all parties to stand down, bringing the hostilities to a close and even getting a pretty sweet deal for the Wolves into the bargain. Nowadays, it seems like his spirit stands vigil over the Fang, the Space Wolves Fortress Monastery, even as his mortal form sleeps. One could make a tenuous analogy to the Emperor and his battles with denizens of the Warp in terms of his task here, and whilst he's never gotten over his supposed abandonment by Leman Russ, he seems to accept that this is his fate, a fate which Russ had somehow known about and planned around all that time ago. There is another particularly infamous Space Wolves dreadnought, in this case one believed much more young than the exceptionally ancient Bjorn. The identity of the original individual entombed in this sarcophagus is unknown, but it does have a name: Murder Fang, seemingly a Wolfen dreadnought incapable of being controlled, but that shares a kinship with those afflicted by the curse of Russ's genetics. Murder Fang was found by the Great Company of Logan Grimnar in 960 M41 on the hell world of Omnicide, tearing apart a fort of traitor Astartes with its massive lightning claws. They were able to freeze the dreadnought using their unique Hellfrost stasis technology before transporting it back to the Fang. It is kept in the caverns below the fortress monastery unless things get so desperate that it must be unleashed. When it is, it goes on a rampage until it is refrozen by the wolves, and whilst they likely hate the fact it exists due to it being the worst embodiment of the curse of the Wolfen, they do acknowledge its utility both on the battlefield and even with hunting down other Wolfen. To jump out to the Horus Heresy for a moment, I need to update a tale mentioned back in my Legions miniseries, that of Rylanor, Master of Rites of the Emperor's Children Legion. Rylanor had seen the entirety of the Great Crusade, becoming a dreadnought after battles with the Eldari some decades before the Horus Heresy. He was part of the loyalist contingent sent down to be purged on Istvan III, and though he survived the virus bombing and other bombardments that followed, he was presumed dead for the longest time by basically everyone. In fact, Rylanor had instead been left underground on guard duty by acting commander Saul Tarvitz, and whilst he eventually went insane from being left alone, just like Garviel Loken did, he maintained a base goal: revenge on his Primarch Fulgrim for the betrayal. This revenge would take 10 millennia to enact, as Rylanor somehow constructed a psychic beacon to tempt the Phoenician to Istvan III once again. The now demonic Primarch ripped the Contemptor apart, but there was one trick left to play: an undetonated virus bomb, presumably from the original traitor bombardment 10,000 years ago. This explosion presumably wounded Fulgrim to some extent, but it was the Primarch's pride that suffered the greatest blow from Rylanor's spiteful and insane suicide act. Finally, I wish to discuss one more dreadnought before we move on, specifically Magneric of the Black Templars chapter. He had been a hero of the Horus Heresy as part of the Imperial Fist Legion, and was a close friend of the First Templar High Marshal Sigismund, but he became a dreadnought I believe sometime after the Legion was split into chapters during a battle with the Iron Warriors. Unfortunately, he wasn't what you'd call a very good dreadnought, despite holding the rank of Marshal. He didn't enter the supposedly mandatory sleep cycles anywhere near as much as he should have, and his fanaticism was off the charts even by the Templars' standards. This fanaticism was mainly vented on the Iron Warriors' warsmith Calcator, who may have been involved personally in the fight that caused Magneric's internment, but even when the Dreadnought Marshal finally caught up again with the warsmith, it was under rather unique circumstances. You see, this was during the War of the Beast in M32, and the Orcs were currently in the process of running roughshod over pretty much the entire galaxy. So it was on the world of Zelenic 4 where Calcator and Magneric were fighting, and then the unthinkable happened. With the aid of Magneric's Castellan calming the Marshal down, the two forces worked together against the Greenskins. Both of them survived and somehow went their separate ways without killing one another, and whilst Calcator would go on to work with and even turn a force of the Fist's exemplar later in the war, Magneric wouldn't see the conflict through to the end. He died in a space battle during the Battle of Vandis, though he did go out with a bang. As the ship he was on, the Obsidian Sky, was overrun by Orcs, the Marshal held the bridge before sending it on a collision course with another Orc vessel. And there you have it, an insight into the Dreadnoughts of the Adeptus Astartes. I realise that there are many more variants of Dreadnoughts in both the Imperium and across other factions, but I think there's too much here to compress into just one log, so they'll get their own combined one or maybe a separate one in future. That said, the Dreadnoughts as they are best known, i.e. the loyal Space Marine ones, are still plenty renowned in their own right. These fallen heroes may lose their minds and or lives as the cost of their internment, but the service they provide on and off the battlefield make them almost critical assets for many chapters. Remember what I said at the beginning of this log? Only in death does duty end. For now though, we must move on. I think that our next log will be another addendum of sorts for a topic I covered long ago. Their slots have been repeatedly reinforced by newly created or discovered creators, and when I discovered them the first time, I did skim over some of the finer points of those that I chose to name. But for the moment, thank you for watching Tactica Imperialis, and I'll see you all again. Goodbye.